Welcome everybody to another session organized by DWA in association with Global Speech and Debate Council and the Debate Center. We are very glad to have you all on board for this session today. We are joined by Alan, and Alan is one of the very good speakers from the subcontinent and as well as a judge from the subcontinent of Asia, and we are very Southeast Asia, and we are very happy to have them on board for discussing adjudicating analysis and deadlocks. This is going to be a very interesting session, so we encourage that all participants do attentively listen in. And for all the people who are watching this on YouTube, feel free to drop in your comments as well on the chat when we are going through the session so that we can relay that to Aaron and Aaron can respond to you. Thank you again, Aaron, for agreeing to come on board with us and doing this for us today. We are very sure that a lot of people will gain a lot from your discussions and your analysis.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to give this lecture. So I know this is titled Adjudicating Masses and Deadlocks, but this isn't just for judges. If you're a debater, you just understand how a judge thinks. And of course, we'll firstly talk about who this workshop is for. It's for beginner educators, of course, intermediate educators, and debaters of all speaker positions, maybe because a lot of people have the problem of not knowing to answer the question, when do I stop analyzing things? So a lot of people don't know when they're over analyzing, when are they under analyzing. So we will also delve onto how should debaters apply this to their own speeches. And of course, disclaimer, of course, I don't claim to be the authoritative debate or know the best. Everything is just based on my experience and my own research on epistemology. I like being weird in debate and applying different philosophies. I also will be introducing concepts from epistemology, of course, that are applied in debating. So they're not always fully transferable, but it's my interpretation of how epistemology is applied in debate. Um, so basically, of course, we have to talk about part one of this lecture. There are just two parts, anyways, just the application and just the theoretical part of this. So the theoretical part is knowing what makes analysis creditable. There might be different forms of graphs you might have seen, might be a cube. I just like doing it on a straight graph. So of course, basically, you can use this imaginary graph where the green part means you're over-analyzing that part. The red part is you're under-analyzing, where the y-axis is the impacts or importance of your argument, and then the x-axis is the proof or likelihood you need to give. So obviously, the blue line is the perfect analysis, like it's fully proven. You don't need more, you don't need less. So this, of course, blue line is the required logical burdens of proof for the impact to be true, which for different there's a lot of lectures about logical burdens of proof there. I recommend you looking at them from different speakers. A lot of them actually have discussed about this, but we're not going to be discuss about that. We're just going to analyze if these analysis under that logical burden of proof is something we can credit and something that is enough for our own speeches. So the question is, what is this blue line that is the perfect analysis? It's not over analyzing, it's not under analyzing, and of course, obviously, it's just the average usual person, where these or five bullet points or five numbers are just taken from the WDC manual. Like you avoid utilizing personal knowledge, but you know global headlines that are big. You give little credit to emotional appeals, but you still credit them if they have rational influence in an argument. You don't presume geographic, cultural, national, or even ethnic other backgrounds when assessing arguments. You have no biases towards that. You, of course, avoid preferences on style. And of course, you assess the merits of the proposed policy solution separate from any personal perspectives in relation to it. So, a lot of things you should already know. I'm assuming you already know these kinds of things. If not, a lot of lectures are out there, even just by judge briefings or just the judging manual in WDC or even UADC. But let's be honest, despite us knowing what the average reasonable person is, we're not actively assessing these bullet points when judging or arguing. We don't always think, is this something the average reasonable person would actually know? Oftentimes we analyze things and we credit things based on intuition. Like sometimes this intuition is, oh, it's creditable. Sometimes it sounds underanalyzed. And what we're gonna delve here today is, how do we explain this intuition to ourselves and to the people we're giving the oral education at, or simply just to we as debaters, how do we appeal to this intuition of the judges? So my goal for this lecture is just to explain and delve into this intuition, nothing more than that, nothing less. And we're not gonna, of course, explain all forms of deadlocks, all forms of analysis. I just wanna talk about this intuition so that when you understand this intuition by its own, you'll discover all sorts of other ways of crediting arguments, understanding why they're wrong, why they're correct, and all through that stuff. So this is where I welcome you to epistemology, where In epistemology, it's a branch of philosophy where it solves a problem of infinite regress. Or infinite regress is basically there's infinite questions to all analysis, to all beliefs. Um, so what epistemology is tries to solve this, it asks the question why we know things despite having incomplete proof information. Like an example of infinite regress is that how do we know gravity exists even though we can infinitely question and answer that, which is the infinite regress. Like we can say gravity exists because we can experience things falling down. How do you know that is gravity? Meaning because it was taught in science schools. How do we know in science class that is true? Meaning because it was researched by scientists, by physicists. How do we know the research is true? And so on and so forth until you ask the atomic level of these things. So there's a lot of things we can infinitely question about things. We can have infinite doubts or the infinite regress of that. Yeah, despite those infinite questions, we just believe gravity exists. Like, we don't question that. Like, it doesn't make sense to question further. And that's what we're gonna be discussing here. Why do we know things despite infinite questions possible? And that applies to debate. Why do we credit things despite, or why are we persuaded on certain things despite infinite burdens in the debate? Like, technically, can call out multiple burdens in the debate. Yeah, despite incomplete burdens, because you cannot build a country in 7 minutes, you cannot prove world peace in 7 minutes. Why do we believe arguments if that's the case? Why are we persuaded? So that's what we're answering on epistemology applied in debating. So let's first deal with the example of infinite regress in debate. So if we want to prove the claim that children cannot consent to big life-changing decisions, infinite regress would look like this. Like first, our analysis that children cannot rationally consent to big decisions because they cannot process available information about them properly. So of course, that by itself might be assertive on itself. So we need to explain it a bit more, which leads to us that they cannot process information well because their brain is undeveloped or underdeveloped and lacks experience. But we can ask the question again, but why is their brain undeveloped? Why do they lack experience? Which could lead to two questions. Their brain is undeveloped because their prefrontal cortex hasn't fully matured yet. And because children lack experience, because they're young, they haven't lived life long enough to, yet compared to adults. And then you can ask another question for each of these again, saying that the prefrontal cortex isn't fully developed yet. This is because their bodies biologically hasn't aged enough for complete development, and that we know their existing experience isn't enough because their youth experiences do not deal with life-changing decisions. Obviously, that's overkill. Like if you analyze all of that until infinity, you're just proving one point in 7 minutes. Obviously, we don't do that. Probably, if you're a speaker, you're probably gonna stop. You're probably gonna stop at this analysis, this two, probably combine them a bit, or maybe here as well. Depends on what you're investing more on. And the question is, why do we stop there? So why do we believe these arguments even if they stop here, even despite multiple burdens we can ask for each of these things? So there are multiple solutions in epistemology to solve this, or to solve the problem on how do we know these things? How are we persuaded? So the first one is foundationalism. So this is our first solution to understanding why we create things despite having multiple questions in them. So foundationalism just says a subset of analysis are self-proving by nature. We call this the foundational analysis. So certain analyses by themselves are just believable by common sense. And there's multiple ways to explain what this foundational analysis is. The most common one in debate is obviously empiricism, which is something that an average useful person should also know. Basically in empiricism, the theory that all knowledge is derived from sense experience. So as long as we can sense them, like I can sense them through my by my eyes, my touch, my nose, whatever, that's something we can credit. That's something we can believe. Or in debate, as long as we can experience what is being analyzed, like they can let us imagine it, or we know people experience them because of the examples they give, the analysis should be credited. Like right, something like that, right? So as long as you know that this analysis, this argument can be experienced by people, it should be credited. So a good example is that students from developing countries enrolling into Ivy League schools are often stuck with exorbitant amount of student loans due to expenses incurred in Ivy League schools. Maybe we ourselves don't experience this. I'm not in an Ivy League school, but I know this is something I can credit. I know I'm persuaded by this because I know some people do experience this. Maybe you're from Vietnam, from India, from the Philippines. Oftentimes you do incur a lot of student loans just being in an Ivy League school without a full scholarship. That in itself is creditable because analysis gives you an experience of what someone is already experiencing, and we know people experience them. That's the reason why it's just empirical in nature. It can be sensed by someone that we know. So In empiricism, basically, the more visceral the analysis, so the more detailed you are in analysis, narrating the life of these people, how it looks like, the easier it is to imagine these are empirical. Therefore, if you can make me visualize, make me experience just through your speech what people are experiencing, what your arguments are like visually, or even just even emotionally, I could probably create this a lot. And this is the benefit of being visceral in debate. So this allows you to better analyze things much more foundationally. And of course, this also means that examples play a role in proving analysis. Like oftentimes, a lot of people now neglect examples. They think that it's not necessary. Probably just think that's it's just style points. But examples prove your analysis a bit more. It makes them more empirical. It makes them more uh, I guess viable or like creditable, right? Because average user persons know like big examples. So when you're giving examples, they are not analysis by their own, but they make your own analysis much more visceral, much more empirical. So it has to demonstrate your argument. Obviously, these are just like still common sense. Like a lot of this is still taught by a lot of people, but this is the first reason why we create things. They're just empirically true. We know people experience them. The second is rationalism, meaning that as long as knowledge has rational reasons, it is self-proving and should not be fallacious. Meaning, for example, there's logical sequencing of events and also that stuff. It's not a hasty generalization, but it's a valid generalization. Or maybe it is consistent to all other forms of analysis you've given. It should be proven. Like, it's just logically true. It just logically makes sense. It should be proven. For example, maybe this example isn't as empirical, but if my argument is logically like this, if minorities aren't given any form of representation to craft laws for them, they will find representation in other ways like violence and revolutions. That sounds logically true. Obviously, the average reasonable person can follow that logical sequencing of events. Maybe there's not much incentive analysis there. There's not much capacity analysis. But just because it logically makes sense, it leads from one to another. There's causal links in here. We already credit this argument because it just makes sense logically. It's rational analysis. And the third one is just ethical intuitionism. So there's just moral truths that we all believe to be true or all believe are important. Like for example, we all believe that war is undesirable because people die in war. Like that's just something we morally agree on. Like most people actually at least. And that there's intrinsic benefit to having autonomy, which is why autonomy and agency is such a popular argument and debate. These are things that we just all morally believe are simply important. Therefore, if they give you an argument about agency, we intuitively think this is important. I'm not saying you should always believe it's important. I'm just explaining why you intuitively think it's important because by ethical intuitionism, you feel it's important just because everyone accepts it as it is. If it isn't at least questioned. So that sort of stuff. That's a third way to talk about foundationalism. So that's the first solution, foundationalism. The question is I guess the question is, what's the conclusion we have for that? The conclusion here is simple. Some analyses are self-proving and should not be seen as assertive. Just because it's a one-liner doesn't mean it's assertive. If that one-liner is just an ethical intuitionism, it's also empirical, like common sense, you should credit it as long as the analysis, even if it's not one liner, like blocks of analysis, as long as the analysis ties back to a foundational analysis, maybe it's logically sequenced well, maybe it ties back to a really, really good example, it should be creditable. I'm not saying that it's fully credited, I'm just saying it should be creditable. It should be credited enough to be weighed in the debate. It's not assertive. So I guess the problem here is that some people have a lot of problems when I teach this. They have a lot of problems on what is something we consider foundational analysis, especially in empiricism. I'm just saying I'd say that anything that is general truth should be should be something that we consider foundational, like compared to subjective value judgment, meaning things that are too subjective for us to believe. For example, like general truths on the left, subjective value judgments on the right. For example, most people have biases towards their loved ones. I think this is a general truth, meaning because even you yourself experience that, right? Compared to the analysis that people are currently lazy, I guess the word inherent makes it very, very questionable. Like, are people really by default lazy? Is this something we all believe, we all experience? Probably not. Therefore, it's just subjective. It's just a way for us to look at things subjectively. It's not something that is self-proving on its own. So it's just a subjective value judgment. We're not really sure that people are inherently lazy. That's at best a theory. or maybe the law doesn't always succeed in holding corrupt people accountable. I do think that that is something that's a general truth. I think that we all have empirical experiences, um, like, or at least we know people who have experiences um, that are not served justice, that was failed by the court. So that is something we believe as general truth. Therefore, that by its own is creditable. Compared to like analysis like absolute power corrupts absolutely. That's quite vague. That's a valid judgment. So we don't credit that on its own. It needs its own proof. Um, uh, and then of course, thirdly, maybe state-to-state invasions are messy and disregard a lot of human rights. I guess there's a lot of examples we can even cite with this, but that's generally true. I think most people know this. And compared to things like analysis, like saying most people support state interventions, I don't think we can make that generalization. We're not sure if that's the case. Therefore, it's not a general truth. It's just subjective value judgment. And of course, discourse is necessary for democracy. Discussions help us understand how different ideas clash. I think for most people, this is a general truth. Like the bread and butter of democracy is discourse, discussions, compared to like subjective analysis thing, like most people are stuck in their echo chambers. This is quite vague, not empirical at all. Needs a bit more illustration for us to credit. So the tip here is that if you're not sure if what you're saying is a general truth or foundational, it's the kind of like in between blurred lines, then it's probably just a valid judgment. Might as well just give reasons to prove it. Okay, so it's just simple as that. So again, the first solution we have is foundationalism. Some arguments by itself are quite self-proving, whether it be through empiricism, rationalism, or ethical intuitionism. There's a question here. For people just starting out, how to utilize these concepts in the case prep that you are doing. We'll explain this later on. But simply, when you're doing case prep, just think of reasons that are foundational by themselves, and that is enough evidence for it to be proven. You don't need to prove it further. That's just how you utilize it. Okay, as long as it's foundational, it's enough evidence by itself. It can be credited, not fully creditable, but it can be credited. So other conclusions we can have from solution one is that we need to understand why we are persuaded by pure intuition. Like, and foundationalism help us explain why we're convinced in foundationalist analysis as a judge. Because we just credit things intuitively and we just say, um, Team OG explained this, and that. Opposition was not able to respond to this, but we don't explain why did we credit opening government. We don't always need to explain that, but sometimes we do when these are contentious rounds, when a lot of opponents are trying to question that these are assertive. You have to explain why you didn't think it was assertive. So our ways to explain that is through our foundationalism. We just think it's empirically true. It's something that most people do experience. Instead of just saying an average result person believes this, you can explain it this way. You can say that it is something I can credit because it has strong rational logical sequencing, or you can say it's just ethically intuitive. Like obviously dying is bad, so you can just explain it like that. Why you credit things over the other. And now that you know that as a debater, you know now the biggest sources of persuasion. So make your argument sound as foundationalist as possible. Make it sound as intuitive as possible, as something that sounds like general truths or something that's logically sequenced very, very well. So as long as you do that, as long as your arguments sound foundationalist, it should be good enough for the debate. But of course, this by itself, like it isn't a foolproof solution. Like even in epistemology, foundationalism has a lot of critiques saying that, well, there's no such thing as foundationalist knowledge. Like all these things can still be questioned as per the infinite regress. So we can give an example. Like maybe I could say giving military aid to other countries will lead to losses to your own economy. That's why is that to your own? That's supposed to your own. Let me just fix that. Okay. What this means here is simple. What this means now is very simple. That logically probably makes sense, like military aid or whatever, sounds free because it's aid. But if we question that logic, we question that foundational question, we can just say, is military aid really free? No, we can say these aids are often attached with other indirect transactions, like in order for me to give you military aid, you have to sign this contract that we're gonna trade weapons with each other, I'm gonna sell you weapons and other deals and all sort of that stuff. Okay, these kinds of things kind of help a lot. So again, if someone gives foundationalist forms of analysis, just question the premise of it, just question the foundation of it. Is it really free or whatever? The second solution here is coherentism. We know analyses are true because they're coherent to system of beliefs. So I have two applications here, but simply that as long as it's coherent to some system of beliefs, it's something we can credit. For example, it's coherent to the principles of democracy. We should credit it. It's consistent to the principles of autonomy, or of capitalism or whatever. Maybe it does make sense. Maybe it is something we can credit. So the first one is applied in weighing. You can see this a lot in weighing principles. For example, the example is we are willing to trade off agency as laborers because we trade off all the time. For example, when we sign contracts, we traded off a lot of our agency as we are restricted by deadlines and tasks within work. So I'm just saying it's okay to trade off our agency again because we already traded off it through capitalism, through work. So therefore, it is valid. It should be credited. It should be something that is um, something we can credit, something we can already believe is true, that we are willing to trade this off. Or another one is the example on choice. Choice is important in this debate because it is vital to the democratic systems. Where in democratic systems, it understands that it cannot impose one singular form of pursuit of happiness because everyone has a different judgment of what is best for them. Thus, we allow choice by default. Thus, because the principle of choice is consistent to status quo, we should protect this right. So basically, it just explains that choice is important for democratic systems or for democracy, and we already allow a lot of choices from different pursuits of happiness in status quo. Therefore, since it's consistent and coherent with status quo, we should value choice in this debate a lot. So that's the first way of trying to prove things. We prove that choice is important, coherentism. We prove that agency is important, coherentism. I guess this is the more intuitive part of coherentism. The second one is something that I feel like happens a lot, but people don't realize it, is on spamming layers. So instead of making coherent to a system of beliefs, you create your own system of beliefs by giving sets of analysis, and that sets of analysis become a system on its own. So an example here is we believe that most people are unlikely to vote for the best possible political candidates because number one, people are irrational actors in voting because they're influenced by populism. Number two, people are lazy voters. They do not really research deeply each candidates. People are biased voters because they oftentimes vote those who have the biggest name recall. People are also apathetic to political issues because they don't consume lots of media. People are too selfish when voting, i.e., they don't vote for representation of other minority groups. So you might hear someone spamming like 5 layers with one example each, and you do credit them. A lot of us would probably credit it, and the reason why we credit them is because they're all coherent. They're all coherent to each other. They all are like supporting each other. I guess they're all trying to prove one point, and since they're all coherent to each other, it just sounds true. It sounds like this mini system of belief just sounds true. Like all of these are true. All of them are supporting each other. That's why we credit spammers. But you have to understand that all 5 of these layers are still assertive on their own. We just credit them just because they're coherent with each other. Like, if you just take it on its own, people are rational actors in voting. That's just assertive. That's not proven true. People are lazy voters. People are biased voters. And of course, these examples don't really prove the argument. These are just examples, arguing by examples. These are not proof. So that on its own, like these are just 5 assertions layered on top of each other. Yet we still credit them. We credit them not because we are biased. We credit them because it sounds good to credit it because they're all coherent with each other. It goes on the theory of coherentism. So that's the reason why it sounds like it's self-proving because they're all coherent to each other. They're all proving each other through being consistent. Therefore, because all of these reasons are coherent, probably there's a lot of reasons to prove why this argument is true. People are unlikely to vote for the best political candidates. So that's why we credit spammers. So the conclusion here is simple. Layered assertions are credited simply because they are coherent. We only credit some forms of weighing consistent status quo because they are also coherent. But understand that this line of thinking, when analyzing this analysis, has flaws. Um, Thus, we also know how to beat these forms of weighing analysis. Like, firstly, just make them sound contradictory to each other. You can say, for example, when they're saying that status quo allows for freedom, we can say, no, we also limit choices in status quo. So your argument is incoherent. Your argument doesn't stand because your weighing doesn't make sense. It is inconsistent. Or if there are multiple layers of analysis, you can just say, The first thing they say is X, but later on they say Y, which contradicts all of these things. So let these layers contradict themselves, explain how it contradicts itself. Or simply you can just say, here's their strategy. They're just giving you layers of assertions without any proof in them. I'm gonna beat them through actually giving foundational proof. You can also do that just to beat spammers if they don't have any foundational proof in these analysis. You can also challenge the premise of the system of belief of this. For example, when they say the law, like for example, oh, we should all be deontological because the law is deontological. That's justice. You can just say, well, if the law is deontological, like it focuses more on morality than utility, then we don't think that is a good thing in the first place. Then we are willing to change status quo as well. Things like that, or things like, for example, so are you also willing? So if you want freedom, like freedom of choice or about autonomy, like through smoking, are you also willing to support drugs because it's about the autonomy? Obviously not, because like we don't support that in status quo. We don't support drugs. You can just question that. You can say, well, maybe we should support this. Like we should support drugs. Maybe people should be able to use drugs under controlled circumstances. See, in Corintheism, just challenge the premise of it, challenge the Corintheism of it, because just because it's coherent with one another doesn't mean that these things by their own are self-proving as well. So challenge the coherentness of it. Or for example, when they give you multiple layers, they can just summarize all of these layers into one premise. You can say their whole layers of analysis lies in the premise that people cannot be educated on how to vote, that they're all very stupid and they can no longer be educated. We will prove why that isn't the case. So I no longer needed to respond to each analysis early on about these five layers. I just summarize them into one premise and then I'm gonna rebut that premise. By that own, it's easier to deal with them by understanding where it becomes persuasive. So that's the first two. The third solution is von Herentism. In von Herentism, basically this is just a combination of coherentism and foundationalism, where we say analyses are both foundational by their own and also coherent to system of beliefs. So they're not just self-proving, but they're also coherent to systems of beliefs. Like in general, in the motion this house would not ban smoking, we can have both foundationalist and coherent analysis. When you combine them, that's coherentism. This was coined by Susan Hack, like very, very recently, by the way. So basically, you can just say choice is an important value in this debate because the harms of to our health is something that people are subjectively willing to trade off because they value the catharsis of brought by cigarettes more than its harms. This cost benefit analysis differs from person to person. Thus, the state should not monopolize how people see their health and their cigarettes. The state should allow people to make these own judgments by themselves. Now, obviously, this is something we can verify by foundationalism because we do know that some people value this catharsis from cigarettes over their own physical health. Like that is something we know exists. So therefore, it's foundational by its own, and we make this coherent. This exact situation already exists in combat sports, where its harm to athletes' health is something that some people find bad, but some people find something tolerable because they value the experience in that sport more. They value the experience in boxing. They value the experience um, in combat or whatever, the adrenaline from that, even though it risks their own bodies. Thus, we should not ban smoking because it's also coherent to other forms of systems of beliefs. It's coherent to how we already treat combat sports, maybe even alcohol, maybe even gambling. So I didn't just give you foundational analysis, I also gave you something it's coherent with. Therefore, it's hard to rebut. I can rebut why combat sports should be banned, but it doesn't really disprove my foundational reason on why choice matters in this debate on subjective forms of cost benefit analysis. You may be able to try to rebut my foundationalist analysis, but that doesn't really disprove that my argument is still coherent with other things you've already legalized. So it makes it harder to rebut, obviously. And the second way of applying this is just to spamming layers again. But instead of just having assertions per layer, we all make these layers foundational and coherent with each other. So you're not giving a lot of even ifs here. You're just giving multiple reasons, and each of these reasons are coherent and they're all self-proving by themselves that even if we remove two of these reasons, it's still standing. So maybe in the argument that people are likely to be rational when transitioning genders, we can prove this in three ways because number one, firstly, because it's a really big decision that alters their life. People, when faced with big decisions, think thoroughly before pushing through. This looks like knowing your appearance will significantly change and parts of your body will never be the same, as you take so much time to think this through, whether it will be months or years. So this is the first reason. I think this is something we can verify. Obviously, in life-altering decisions that changes your body, we think this really, really true. Like that's something that's intuitively believable. We know people experience this, not just in gender framing care, not just in transitioning. Secondly, because people are likely to consult others in this decision as well. When it comes to life altering decisions, they consult their friends, if not their parents. They ask questions towards other people who have transitions or who have transitioned, but is that with an S, and even probably stumbled upon criticisms and risks of transitioning. This is because people have like to have as much information as much as possible before taking big decisions. We all know this as well. Like before taking a big decision, before taking a big risk or a life altering decision, we try to research about things very, very much. Like before traveling to another country, you obviously research where you're gonna go, what's the culture of the other countries are like, things like that, right? So it's by itself foundational. And number three, lastly, because transitioning is a long time commitment, it takes a lot of time when taking different pills for the effects to be visible. And in this time, we slowly see how it changes our bodies, our voices, and even our relationships. So not saying about before the decision making process, but during the transition period. In this transition period, we also get to calm down and think about decisions longer. We understand and think in front of our mirrors if we want to continue this transition or we want to reverse it. That just explains that while you're transitioning, you're probably looking in the mirror, see how it changes you, and you get to self reflect whether this is a good transition for you, whether you like it, whether you like how it's affecting your life and your relationships. That itself also something we can verify because it's human experience. We something we can believe upon. It's quite empirical. We can imagine someone experiencing these things. And you combine these three things, not only are they them by their own foundational, because they're all human experiences we can imagine and we know people are experiencing, but they're all coherent to each other. They're not contradicting. Therefore, each layer is hard to respond to. And each layer, even if you remove one layer, those two other layers will probably work on their own because they're not only relying on coherentism, they also are by themselves are pillars on these. That's coherentism. You can improve your spamming layers or just layering just by being more coherent in analysis. I guess my suggestion, if you want to do these kind of things, just for analysis, just explain what, how, and why. What happens? How does this look like? Why does this happen? And per layer, by the way. And this would help each of your analysis to become coherent on its own. Because it's very visible, because it has logic on why does this happen. It has examples on how does this look like. And by stacking them into multiple layers, it just is coherent. It's hard to respond. So this is probably the hardest thing to rebut. So the conclusion to solution tree on panherentism is that obviously panherentism is very hard to rebut, but they're also very hard to build in the first place. It takes a lot of time. Ask yourself, is it worth taking so much time to build this? To have 3 layers or 5 layers of inherent analysis. And of course, if a team uses panherentism, this doesn't mean that their arguments are bulletproof. The same criticisms apply to both currentism and foundationalism still applies. That these foundational proofs are still questionable, like you can question the foundation of them, and you can just need to explain the inconsistencies with the explanations. You can explain why it contradicts each other, right? Or rebut the premise. Probably you have to do both at the same time though, because it's hard to rebut. Like you can't just rebut one foundation. You have to rebut all foundations and make them all sound incoherent with each other to defeat that. But the reason why we should know this, why certain types of analysis like this exist, despite some successful rebuttals, we still think that some arguments still stand despite convincing rebuttals. It's because probably some of the arguments we think that are very, very resilient have some foundation inherentist elements. And through understanding inherentism, understanding the structure of these arguments, we understand why we can still create arguments despite successful rebuttals, why some rebuttals are not strong enough. So those are 3 solutions: foundationalism, coherentism, and panherentism. Part two. So I am surprised for actually ending this very, very less than 1 hour, I think. Probably because I speak really fast. So those who are on YouTube just like probably just slow down the speed. So we have to compare analysis as well. Um Now that we know the theoretical part on what makes things persuasive, how do you create things, it's now time to compare analysis towards each other. So you can do this as whip, as deputy, or even as first speaker, most likely probably judging. So now that we understand what makes arguments sound persuasive, we must compare each task to each other. By analysis, I mean all analysis. Arguments, framing, rebuttals, all of these can clash with each other. You have to make sure that you're actually also um that you're actually also analyzing how good these rebuttals are. So you have to measure whether the rebuttals exploit the weaknesses of these theories of epistemology. Each example does it point out the inconsistency of this coherentist analysis? Does it disprove foundation? Or does it disprove the foundation? Or if not, analyze if the rebuttal itself is persuasive. If by itself it is foundational, it is coherentist, it is coherentist, that's why one-liner rebuttals work, because the rebuttals are oftentimes intuitive, because they are foundational by itself. So, of course, an important tip is that, especially as a judge, you might say one team didn't explain this, but all forms of burdens have to be applied comparatively. Okay, so when we're comparing analysis, especially when we're introducing these concepts, we don't have to use the concepts, by the way, like the name of the concepts about foundationalism or coherentism in our OAs. You can reword them to how it makes sense to you. Um, if you applied one burden to another, you always have to apply it to the opposite team, right? You cannot just unevenly apply burdens. For example, if opposition said, OO said, OG never analyzed why big health companies have the incentive to never increase the raise of their doctors, or the non-incentive rather. But if they're accusing basically OG that they didn't prove that X harms wouldn't happen. But you can actually just ask the question, like, did team opening opposition prove the opposite burden? Did they prove that these harms of never increasing the raise of their doctors would actually happen? Probably not, right? They're just pushing burdens, pushing harms that they've never proven true. So obviously, if they're accusing one team, they're calling out one team for never proving likelihoods, the opposite team should be burdened as well to prove the counter likelihoods of this. Okay? So that's one important thing we have to understand when comparing analysis, when applying these solutions um to the infinite regress. Let's go with examples. So the first example is we compare these two arguments. So in team government, they say we believe that most people are unlikely to vote for the best possible candidates, because people are rational actors in voting, people are lazy voters, people are biased voters, people are apathetic to political issues, people are too selfish in voting, and they have all examples by their own. Versus opening opposition says people are likely to learn from voter education because, number one, educational campaigns are oftentimes funded by the government that appears to almost every television, social media ad, or even posters. So the education is oftentimes inescapable. Second, they say that most people have the capacity to learn them because these ads are crafted in ways to be highly digestible, e.g., using very layman language, while context like not selling your vote is easy to digest, easy to understand. And thirdly, it just takes some friends in your circle to be educated, and they themselves will convince a lot of their friends to vote wisely too. Because these people have learned the importance of voting. They know that if their friends, sorry about that wrong punctuation, if their friends vote unwisely, their own lives are at risk. So we compare these two arguments. I can just basically summarize this as simply saying the open government argues that most people are irrational when when being able to vote things. They have a lot of biases, a lot of irrationality, incapacity. Opening opposition says despite them being irrational, we can still educate them. Why did I believe opening opposition more? It's simple. I think mainly because opening government was relying on layers of assertions without really proving these assertions. Like, for example, they explain things like people are irrational actors in voting. They don't really give a reason why they're irrational. They give examples like they are influenced by populism, but these examples by themselves are also assertive. They don't really prove the argument. They give you assertions like people are lazy voters, but they don't really prove why. They don't really research deeply candidate. We don't really have where you don't really oftentimes research these candidates. And all from those analysis only just have assertions with some examples without proving the analysis to be true. Compared to opening opposition, where they explain what it looks like to educate people and why people are likely to be educated. Like, it's so simple to understand this because these materials are done well. They cannot escape this education because it's done almost everywhere. So they're bound to listen to them. They're bound to see them in posters, or simply that their friends will be the ones convincing them. Obviously, I believe opening opposition more, and this where it comes with comparing the deadlocks, mainly because opening opposition has better illustration of what these arguments look like, what education looks like. Therefore, it's easy for me to visualize these arguments. It's easy for you to understand how people learn, what prevents people from learning, and it's easy for me to understand how uneducated voters become educated on their side. Compared to open government, they don't really give you visceral analysis to why this is generally true. It's just assertions. So it's harder for me to believe opening government. So probably I'm going to believe opening opposition more, that people are going to be educated, mainly because there's better illustration, which goes to the empirical foundationalism we told earlier. Thus, OO wins against OG. We believe that these voters will probably be likely rational. See, it's simple as that. Instead of just saying OG didn't disprove OO, meaning because maybe they don't have the opportunity to disprove them, or we just said, oh, I believe opening opposition. We also explain why we believe them comparatively to open government. We just said OG by their own is quite assertive in these layers, which is rely on coherentism, compared to opening opposition, where each of their layers are also foundational. They're also empirical, something we can visualize, something we can imagine because of their illustration. So that allows me to understand why OO's analysis is much more persuasive than OG. OO is a bit more coherentist. OG is a bit more coherentist. You don't say, of course, coherentist and coherentist, because those are jargons. I'm just using these words to better demonstrate the lecture. Let's go for another example. So maybe the argument on opening government is say we should not ban smoking because choice is an important value in this debate, because the harms to our health is something that people are subjectively being trade off, because they value the catharsis brought by cigarettes more than its harms. This cost benefit analysis differs from person to person. Thus, the state should not monopolize how people see their health and their cigarettes. The state should allow people to make these own judgments by themselves. This exact situation already exists in combat sports, which we explained earlier, where even though combat sports is objectively bad for athletes' health, it is subjectively, for some athletes, it's subjectively better for them to experience combat sports, the adrenaline of them all. And thus, these harms, despite guaranteed, almost guaranteed, is something tolerable. Thus, we should also ban smoking because it's also coherent to how we ban things in status quo at the moment. So, a bit coherentism. The first paragraph is a bit more foundational. We analyze catharsis, how people see smoking. Number two, we compare it to something we already allow with similar forms of analysis, like boxing or combat sports. And if opening opposition responds by saying that, no, we should ban smoking because the state has the obligation to protect its citizens, it is the best interest to uphold public health and to prevent people from harming themselves. These subjective assessment of cost benefit analysis are assertive because it assumes that most people are rational when opting into smoking. Most of the time, they are not. So we tried opening government a bit more here because number one, they said OG is assertive. We didn't think it's assertive. They have foundational reasons. Like their arguments by their own are self-proving, intuitively true. Something we know people experience, something people we know that people think about. And number two, opening opposition doesn't really prove that people are irrational. So they are pushing burdens against OG without solving the same burdens themselves. They say OG didn't prove that these people are rational. OO never explained why these people are irrational when smoking. So obviously, by two reasons, OG wins. Number one, OG isn't assertive, and number two, OO never proved their counterpoint. They never proved their call out the comparatively. They never proved that they are irrational. And number three, we can give another reason, like the analysis about um the government or the state has the best interest to protect its citizens, we can say that's unresponsive or uncomparative to how opening government weighs their argument of something they already do in status quo. So OG creates coherent weighing on OG, while opening opposition doesn't really weigh why the interest to uphold public health is much more important. So OO just explains that this is just important by its own. OG explains that these are important and something we're already doing right now. So therefore, OG is a bit more persuasive in the weighing as well. So we already broke that deadlock. Despite opening opposition's call out is true, we still buy opening government's analysis a bit more because of the reasons we told earlier. And the last example is this house supports the radicalization of the environmentalist movement. We as opening government, we say we support this because the environmentalist movement is not stupid when doing radical means. They will likely do radical forms of protest rationally, like targeting the rich, big corporations, or strategic publicity, even if it's sometimes negative. What it means is that all of these strategies have strong direction and planning done onto them. This is because the environmentalist movement are diverse. It is made out of academics, scientists, investors, and even the children of oil barons, like one of the founders of Just Stop Oil is an oil heiress. Thus, people are rational and calculated when doing radicalization. Opening opposition says, firstly, the argument fails or false because they didn't prove that the environmentalist movement is diverse. Second, even if they prove they are diverse, they didn't prove that these investors and oil heirs are not perversely managing the environmentalist movement just to make the movement look bad. Number three, and even if they are benevolent actors, they've never proven that these same people are indeed smart or rational. It's just an assertion. And number four, thus you cannot believe that radicalization is done under rational means. It is often done irrationally, which is why massive uncontrolled backlash exists against it today. So basically, three calls from opening opposition. Yeah, I won't call it opening opposition here because number one, like these are just layers of callouts. They never prove the opposite burden. Like for example, they say they have never really proven why the environmentalist movement is diverse. I think that is self-proving when they give examples like scientists, academics, investors. I think these by their own are something we know happens. They give an example of an oil baron on Just Stop Oil who's supporting the environmentalist movement. Obviously, that's something we can verify because it's a big example as well, or at least something we know exists, something that we know people experience. So that first call out is just faulty. It's not assertive. They did prove that because it's already self-proving by its own. You don't need to inflict additional burdens. Number two, even if they are diverse, they didn't prove that these investors are an oil heiress or that perversely managing the environmentalist movement just to make the movement look bad. Again, they didn't really prove this in OJ, but opening opposition never really proved that they have perverse incentives, the opposite incentives. So I wouldn't credit this as well. It's just inflicting infinite burdens. Number three, even if they're benevolent actors, they've never proven that the same people are indeed smart or rational. I think by its own, like scientists, investors, I'm not sure why these are not rational people. I don't think these are assertions. I think these are rational analysis. These are intuitive by its own because it's foundational. Uh, so we didn't even believe the third call out from opening opposition. Maybe they are true, but the comparative burdens are also not proven by opening opposition. Thus, I wouldn't believe that the radicalization under this analysis from opening opposition is done irrationally. I would probably believe opening government more because OO never really proven their counter analysis, their counter arguments. They never really give you any foundational reasons or intuitive reasons for us to believe this. Thus, I don't think opening opposition can win over OG despite correct call outs. So again, despite smart calls from opening opposition, they've never proven the opposite burden, or sometimes their accusations are just false. Like it's not assertive, it's just foundationally true. So OJ wins this basically, because of these things. So that's basically everything we need to learn about analyzing deadlocks and basically analysis. And of course, those are just the basics of it. And the way you analyze and understand the concepts will differ from person to person and how you apply them to your judging, how you apply them to your debating. The important thing is that at least if you're a debater, you know what are the intuitions of these judges. We're just able to explain them a bit better on our side. Therefore, you know how to play towards these intuitions on why they know or why they are persuaded. If you're a judge, you now better know how to explain your intuitions, assuming you're not being biased, of course. Therefore, it's easier for you to word out your OAs, why you believe one thing over the other, especially in very, very contentious and tight rounds. So before we end, are there any questions? What would you recommend we take to account when teams are obviously skewing the debate? How do we make things clear in judge sheets? I think if they're skewing the debate, I think you just like, mark it like saying uncharitable, unresponsive. What I do is I don't take notes through my computer. I do it through paper, so I have different colored pens. Let me just get my pens. First, my pens at the moment. Okay, here it is. So I usually use like a pink pen, just to say that this is uncharitable. So always just mark it down. Don't be afraid to mark it down. You're not transcribing things anyways. You're taking notes. Um, so yeah, different colored pens would work. Highlighting them on different colors as well works, or make your own symbols. Okay, that if that makes sense. Any other questions? Okay, I think I'll end this lecture then in 1 minute if there's no other questions. Oh wait, there's another question. In the debates that run grossly parallel and there's still no method to of finding it out what to do. Okay. So what this does is that is on analyzing deadlocks. But what if we want to elevate the deadlock? Like obviously the framing that has the most empirical analysis or the most foundational from inheritance should win, but obviously not all judges think that way. So what you do is that simple. You can of course always analyze, is this an either or? Is this clash? Is this deadlock an either or? So if that's the case, if it's not, then it's easier. If it's not an either or, you can always analyze. Okay, there are X incentives for them to be rational. There are Y incentives for them to be irrational. Both of these NASes, by your own, are believable. So just assume that 50% of people are rational, 50% of other people are irrational. So debate the debate then based on this new framing that these both of these are true at the same time. How do people react rationally, irrationally, differently? Things like that. So just buy both framings sometimes, like as of course a debater, not as a judge. Um, so that's if it's parallel and it's not an either or. But what if they say no, this debate exists in developing countries? No, it only exists on a developed country, or they say it's an actor motion, so you cannot debate it on the medians. There are multiple scenarios, and you debate on the median. So you say, oh, no, this debate exists where the actor lives in a developing country, or opposition says this debate exists where the actor lives in a developed country. It's very, very parallel. It's an actor motion, so there's only one framing here. I say, um, if that's the case, I say there's a gov advantage here. Like whatever OJ sets up, if it's rational, like we discussed earlier, it should be credited. Opening opposition has to prove that OG's framing, if it cannot be bought at the same time, is irrational, is unfair. But if they say there's an alternative framing that is also fair, then that isn't a successful definition clash or a framing clash. You have to buy OG's framing because the definitional clash, or at least the framing challenge, has to explain why the previous framing is unreasonable. Not that there are other framings we can buy into. In case of judge explaining deadlocks to teams when giving OA, what things would you think I should look out for as a novice judge? So, when you're explaining deadlocks, you should analyze analysis, of course. Like they may have really, really strong analysis or like really strong ideas, but the analysis isn't always equal. Like one analysis is much more built than the other, it's much more visceral than the other. So buy that. Just go back to the technicals. So if there are deadlocks and you're stressed, you don't know which to buy, the easiest way is just go back to the technicals. Which analysis has better examples, much more visceral? Which analysis is much more coherent, has less forms of contradictions? So you go back to what we got from coherentism, foundationalism, and coherentism. So that's just a good way to do it. But if you're a judge and you're not judging high stakes rooms, like it's a sport, just be honest what convinced you and ask the debaters if you think you're biased, something like that. But I suggest if you are in high stakes rooms, you wanna just break, just go back to technicalities. Again, that did one team better analysis than the other? Are both analysis like equally rationally good? Like both of them are really, really strong? Then probably buy both analysis and explain impacts. Like sometimes both teams argue that both arguments are true. If that's the case, both are equally true, then just weigh the impacts. Both are probably true. Weigh the impacts, which impacts are much more frequent, which impacts are much more severe, things like that. It's not just always about the truth value, but whenever things are happening at the same time and are always true, impacts could be your way of just judging the debate as well. What about perceptive biases? I might have that I am not actually creating that luck when I have. I'm not sure what you mean by perspective bias. I might have that I am not. Okay, that I'm not actually creating. Oh, okay. So you might think that you're not creating a deadlock, but you are creating a deadlock. Basically, you don't think you're yeah, okay. So okay, yeah. Obviously, this is done through experience. Just ask the debaters: was I intervening and thinking this is a deadlock? Am I making this sound much more closer than it is? Did I make this sound like a deadlock than it is? And second, of course, just analyze the analysis. Again, analysis. Like, are both analysis equal? Are they both just as persuasive as the other? So you have to compare which one is more persuasive, which one has better analysis, which one has more foundational analysis, foundational knowledge, which one is more coherent. That on its own is a way for you to break deadlocks. Or at least not break deadlocks. That by its own, if you're actively thinking about how they analyze things, you don't buy things out of face value, or you don't just buy your intuition, you analyze your intuition, you'll understand that these things are not deadlocks. Okay? That's how you do it. Just make it in your mind what these concepts actually are. Just analyze each of these things. Honestly, when you're writing down your notes, you should be able to order right by just hearing it. Oh, this is quite assertive. So I'm gonna write assertive, dash assertive on this with a red pen. That would give you more time to come back later and analyze what makes this argument assertive. And then you'll go back to this epistemological analysis or theories and be able to better explain them. If both arguments are assertive, then just probably just don't. If both analyses are assertive, like literally, like no one prove any arguments, then probably it's just a wash. Like if there's no really proof, it's just both assertions, then probably there are other things you could probably focus on. But if there's really nothing, like everything's just assertive, then you just credit what is a bit more persuasive than the other. I honestly I don't really like it when people make it sound more better than it is, like make it sound like make intervene and give it analysis. But I just say, through the characteristics of epistemology or technicals, which one has at least better attempts to analyze? You can say at least this sounds more like this sounds a bit more rational because there's intuition um backing it, like intuitively if people do not vote for X, they would vote for Y. I think that intuitively makes sense, compared to opening opposition where you don't have any intuition backing them. So you also like just if it's not credible by their own, at least analyze the characteristics of these analysis, which one has better characteristics, which one has a bit slightly more persuasive than the other. So for deadlocks, just focus on analysis, the quality of analysis. Sometimes you would hear people just uh even give like very very circular reasoning. Maybe things like um maybe things like people have the best interest to vote for X progressive politician because they have the interest of progressivism. They have the interest of progressivism mainly because um the X politician told them through populist narratives to do them. So that by its own is also circular, so it's not rational empiricism, or it's not rational forms of foundationalism. So it could be disproven or it could be discredited. People induce deadlock so often by strawman or fallacy study. Yeah, correct, actually. Or most commonly, they just simply say, "Oh, this is symmetric for X, Y, Z reasons." So you have to analyze: is it really symmetric? Is there analysis just as the same quality as like OG tells you? If OG explains that people have a lot of unique incentives to be educated through voting, and the opening opportunity says, yeah, but there's also a lot of other incentives for them to learn without education, without voter education, like simply through social media. So it's symmetric, it's a deadlock, it's a wash. No, like the analysis from OG is that there's unique added incentives to learn. Oh, just say status quo has some incentives, but don't really prove more incentives. So if that's the case, the qualitative analysis from opening opposition is severely lacking. It's unintuitive, or it's unengaging. It's not very, very clear to the extent compared to how OG like illustrates them. Yeah. I actually like judging debates with a lot of strawmans or deadlocks or strawmans or fallacies because I get to call them out in my OA. Like I didn't believe this because this is a strawman. This is what OG said. I think that's a good practice. Like call out in your OA why things weren't really really strong deadlocking. Like why their deadlocking isn't strong. I think that if people are trying to symmetricize things, I think that these attempts to symmetricize needs analysis by their own. Either it would be intuitive analysis through foundationalism, or a bit more analysis through coherentism as well, like a bit more layers to prove it's a deadlock. So if it's a one line, it's unintuitive. I don't think it should be ever credited. So always look at the qualitative analysis. So deadlocking is also a form of analysis that's needed. So make sure to also measure that. Any final questions? I'll entertain one more question if there's any in 1 minute.
Are there any more questions, Alan? We can wrap up then.
All right. I think that there are no more questions. So thank you so much everyone then for like tuning in. Like I know that this I did quite speak a bit fast. So if you have any questions, feel free to message me on my Facebook, same name, Allain Christopher, or you can just comment on the YouTube video. I'll probably answer there as well. So thank you so much everyone for having me. Hopefully you learned something about how you view debates and analysis a bit more, how to break these deadlocks as a judge or as a debater. Thank you so much everyone.
so much, Alan, for coming on board and joining us for this. We are very glad that people have had the opportunity to listen to you and understand so much about judging deadlocks and also like how speakers perceive deadlocks as well. Again, thank you for taking the time out and hope to see you again soon.
Thank you so much for having me.